aback by this emphasis of minorities and majorities. Personally, I don't believe we have minorities and majorities in South Africa in an ethnic sense. And I think most South Africans don't see South Africa in that light. But when FW was speaking, what came to my mind is that FW is part of the old guard.
The old guard.
Now, you have the old guard in the ANC who were the nationalists. You have the old guard in the National Party, and FW is part of the old guard. Now, for the old guard, whether ANC or National Party, they see the world through ethnic eyes. And it's just the way it is. I use the example when I spoke of Slagsdagsnack. So if you start from then you have ethnic conflict. That was conflict between the Afrikaners and the English. So people grew up in that world of ethnic conflict. And FW is the product of the world of ethnic conflict. Jacob Zuma is part of the world of ethnic conflict. So their whole world is mirrored through ethnicity, through ethnic descriptions. I think what for the great majority of South Africans today, they see the world in economic terms and in terms of what is happening to South Africa's position in the global world. So the old guard, we are coming to the end, in my view, of the nationalist era. And that generation is aging, FW. But South Africa is no longer part of that world. The nationalist era in South Africa, in a way, that's what the ANC is grappling with. The ANC is grappling with the fact that it is at the tail end of the nationalist era. And it no longer speaks a language that the great majority of South Africans speak. The great majority of South Africans speak an economic language, and they speak a language of human rights. They speak that kind of a language. And so personally, I'm a bit worried about this emphasis on ethnic minorities and majorities. But at the same time, I recognize that the old guard is the old guard. It will continue speaking their vocabulary. That's the only vocabulary that they know.
Okay, got it. So,
thank you, Farrell. Can everybody hear me? As failed politician, I shouldn't ask the question, because I did once when I ran for parliament ask the question, can everybody hear me? And somebody from the back shouted, yes, we can, but we're happy to change places with somebody who cannot.
oh no, he's got one. He wants to speak without it.
So, yeah, let me rather you. I don't know whether this thing helps. It helps. It does help. Okay. Does it help? Right. It does help. Okay, thank you. Yeah, you know, I often engage in debates with people, you know, who either have left South Africa because of a doom and gloom conclusion, or are thinking about it, etc. And we have all these arguments, you know, the pros and the cons. At the end of the day, I developed what I thought was an argument stopper to say, look, at the end of the day, why do I remain extremely positive about South Africa, and Africa for that matter? But let's just deal with South Africa for the moment. Is because I believe that the majority of people in South Africa are good people. I amply illustrated that. But as part of a majority of the good people in South Africa, latching on to Maletsi's point, people think in different terms. And if we today talk about minorities and majorities, that should be the division. Are there people who have a good approach, who are inclined to choose the right way? And are they in the majority? I happen to believe they are, and I happen to want to believe that I'm one of them.
Good. Can you keep it? I want to stay right there. So one of my good people in the world is Thomas Piketty. So I really like his arguments that capital goes to capital, and that the rising tide doesn't lift all boats. And in fact, we live in a time of greater and growing and debilitating inequality, and all we have to do to see that is Moeletzi's pie chart. So your fundamental thesis in your very interesting talk was one that I think most people disagree with. So I'll get to the point. So I really do think we live in an era of state capture. I think what's happening now was an effort to take over the treasury, a horrible, pernicious campaign being waged against the finance minister and his officials. And you can see the state capture impetus at provincial and local government levels everywhere. But the response to it is that, well, there's white monopoly capital. And that may be, yes, Moeletzi a scapegoat. But if you look at the rich list that came out in December, top 10 people on it are all really wealthy. I say 9 of them are white men, and 1 is Atul Gupta, the only black person in there, which is a deep irony. So isn't there a fact, Christo, that our economy hasn't been effectively democratized, as Moeletzi said, and that perhaps the solutions that you put out are too simple ones, that we haven't really risen to the occasion of deeper social and economic justice in our country?
Yeah, Ferial, may I start off by saying that I do not disagree with Piketty when he points, and I think I tried to make that point in my talk, when he points about the existing and growing inequality. We don't disagree on that.
Okay.
And I also made the point that it is not uniquely South Africa. It's a problem that, you know, people have to deal with all over the world. As I pointed out, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report makes that point.
Okay.
It's certainly not uniquely South African. Where I disagree with Piketty and the people in South Africa who push this inequality agenda with all kinds of statistics and sort of, in my view, misinformation, is how do we best address that problem? Now, this morning reference was made by Mr. de Klerk inter alia, I think Moeletzi touched on it, that during the first 10 years of ANC rule, we saw growth in our economy that we hadn't seen for a long time, and we're certainly not seeing now. And we know what happened subsequently. The question is, there is no way that you can address the inequality problem unless you have economic growth. If I may use, the other point that was made, China.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they lifted people out of poverty. In other words, there has been a decrease in inequality per definition. So my argument is simply that that's what you've got to address, not say, well, we've got to take from A to give to B, and in that way, a zero-sum game. The cake is only so big. Let me just quote something, at the risk of sounding like name-dropping. I was at a conference in London at the beginning of December, where the question posed was, can Europe reinvent itself? And John Major, the previous Prime Minister, was on the panel, and the moderator asked him, now, what will you do if you were in charge of Europe today? How would you address this myriad of problems that Europe is facing? And his answer was, he said, first of all, thank God I'm not. But secondly, nothing can be done unless there is economic growth. Thereafter, the two of us sat next to each other at dinner, and I said, but John, the answer you gave begs the question. How do you get economic growth? And you get economic growth because of proper government policies. So it becomes a chicken and an egg. Mm-hmm. That's where I disagree with Piketty.
Got it. And then just finally, before I open up, is so Judge Zach, because he said we must call him Zach, is let's talk about land. So your brother Judge Dikgang Moseneke has been doing a lot of public speaking around his book. And he says that our country hasn't grasped the nettle of effective land restitution, redistribution, and reform. And that he didn't see the courts being used in the ways that the Constitution envisaged. You also said earlier that you can't understand why the state expropriated and paid market value. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Could we have been more aggressive and creative?
I think we could have been more aggressive and creative. You see, we had to choose between two ways of ensuring a redistribution of property.
Mm-hmm.
The one way would be to take the property from one and give it to the other. But the other is a combined way of A, creating the opportunity for people to acquire their own properties, but B, ensuring that the model of our constitution is that the government charges taxes and uses that money to ensure that people's property position improves by paying a fair amount for the property they expropriate. And in that, I'm completely committed to the constitutional way of doing it. You pay people fair, just and equitable compensation in all the circumstances. The taxpayer does it, and the taxpayer is therefore responsible for the transformation of our society. And then there's the tax system. So in today's day and age, if our tax level was about the same as, for example, the British tax level, it might have been a very interesting position. But our whole societal transformation is on the basis that government will do it, and it will do it through taxes, and the people who are rich will pay more taxes. And while I'm talking, can I just say one thing? It is true that there must be economic growth, but nobody can say that we must have economic growth at all costs. If more and more people invest in this country on the basis that they pay salaries of 100 Rand a month to all our workers, we need the kind of economic growth which will benefit all our people. And I do not think economic growth by itself is enough. The chicken or the egg question is not the relationship between government and business. The real problem is there are two kinds of economic growth. The one kind of economic growth will benefit more people. The other kind of economic growth will benefit less people. And generally, we've got to have that kind of economic growth which benefits more. So while I agree that we must have economic growth, because without which you can't make the cake bigger, it does not become so important that you have economic growth at all costs, and you have the kind of economic growth which exacerbates inequality rather.
Thank you. Well, let's see, do you want to respond? And then we open.
Ferial, I think I was a bit surprised, actually, to read in the paper about what Justice Dikgang Moseneke had said about the land. Because,
he keeps saying it.
Yes, he keeps saying it. And I thought, this guy would have understood in Zimbabwe. I think we owns half of the real story in 66. And he was assigned to go and conquer Wales by his boss, and he conquered Wales, and in return for that he was given land. And 980 years later, he still owns that land. And he's gone even further than that. He married somebody somewhere, and they bought land in the west of London, which is today where, for example, the Oxford Street is. And they own that land. So I was laughing to myself thinking, we worried about the Afrikaners owning land from the last 50 years or 100 years or whatever. The British have been living with the Normans, who now nobody remembers that they were foreign conquerors 1,000 years ago, and we're worrying, there is this propaganda game about the land. The reality about land, if you look at land in South Africa today, we have 30,000 farms according to the South African government's 19,000 of those farms are on the market. So if we want to, those who want to redistribute land, the land is there on the market to redistribute if they want it. They can buy it as individual, or the state can buy it. I have visited a farm in Delmas, which the state bought on a willing buyer, willing seller to a gentleman called Mr. Hoffman, I was told by the farm manager. The government paid 8 million rands. This was a beautiful farm with 3 dams on it, fully irrigated. When I got there, it was completely derelict. The farm manager did not even have a jack to replace the wheel, the tire of his buggy. So the question of what's happening to the land, to agriculture, let's be serious. We're talking about agriculture here. As an industry, agriculture in South Africa is declining and declining. The farmers are getting older and older. Their children are moving out of agriculture, and many of them are emigrating out of South Africa. And the rest of young South Africa, black, white, or whatever, are not going into agriculture. And that is the reality. So all the talk that I saw from the Hang really bears no reality to the real economics of agriculture in this country.
Please do.
May I add to that 1 or 2 comments, Maleti? The real foundation of the wealth of the Duke of Westminster's family did not come from the property that they were originally given. That's just of interest. One of the descendants married a widow who had inherited a marshland in what is today the west of London and is Mayfair. And that was the real basis of wealth. I think it illustrates something. I have a friend who's a wine farmer, 9th generation. And he says often in their district, the banks come to him because they have to give somebody a bond, and they say, can you tell us what is land in this district worth? And his answer, I won't use the full word, he always says to the bank, the land is worth F all. But the land has no value. If you do not have the intellectual and capital resources to develop the land, land becomes a burden. That's the first point I want, unless it is in the west of London. It was terrible land, mosquito infested, if you read the history. The second point I want to make is that I'm a shopkeeper, but for my sins, I'm also a farmer. It has to be one of the worst possible ways of making money.
The shopkeeping.
No, not the
farming.
shopkeeping. Thank God. Thank God for the shopkeeping. But so I don't know that there are really thousands of black South African compatriots who have this huge desire. You touched on it. People don't go into farming. It is a problem worldwide again, the depopulation of the country areas. It's a problem in the UK. It certainly is a problem in South Africa because people don't see farming as a sexy business. The third, and I can attest to it, that it is a really lousy business. But obviously there are successful farmers, which brings me to your 30,000 number. The calculation is that there are 30,000 commercial farmers in South Africa. And somebody told me that 70% of those farmers, or 75% of the farmers of that 30,000 produce something like 65 or 70% of our agricultural output. So it's a handful of people that you're talking about that have the land and that produce. Now, food security comes into it. I think the real land hunger, and that is again where government, both national, provincial, and local, fail our people. The real hunger for land is for people to build a home. Again, I've got experience of that. I had to relocate farm workers off Loudensford, 200. I could not find land, eventually found, developed. The City Council of Cape Town came to me and begged me, because I had some surplus properties, please sell us the land because we have to build houses and we don't have land. And I always say, but how is that possible? I mean, South Africa is a huge country. How can we not have land? So we have to identify what is the real desire for land. Is it, distributing farm? I mean, there's 5,000 hectare story. If you've got 5,000 hectares in the Kalahari, I will guarantee you, you will go bust.
Thank you. So I'm sure that it comes from the farmer's mouth, must be true, but at City Press, my experience was something different. One of the best pictures, the most popular we've ever carried, is of Julius Malema, who owned a small farm, and he grew beautiful cabbages, and he stood in the middle, and we took a picture of him. Then he lost his farm for all the reasons, and maybe an additional few. And I think for that, we are going to have a radical land movement. And whether it be for housing or a piece of something to call your own, I think it's going to be a real political issue from now going forward. The other thing is, I don't know who I'm mixed with, but lots of my friends, first generation, middle class like me, the guys, black guys, first thing they do when they amass some capital is go buy one of the farms, well, let's say smaller, I'm sure, than the ones we're talking about, but there's a deep emotional attachment to own a piece of your country that I don't think perhaps we understand fully. But anyway, to open up to you now, I'll take, if okay with you, 3 questions at a time. Tell us whoever you address it to. Who'd like to kick us off? Got 1, 2, please go, sir.
Judge, the question is for you. You mentioned in your speech section 9.2, and you were part of the Constitutional Court when that judgment was given about affirmative action. I can't ask you what would you have done in 2000, what would you have done now if you in the same situation, but you mentioned that affirmative action is not really gone the way that you thought it will go. How can the new voice about affirmative action be changed if that president stands as the president of what the interpretation of 9.2 is, the Van Heerden case that you were part of?
Thank you. I saw a hand at the back there. Yes?
Actually, if I may, can I ask 2 questions? Would that be improper?
Sure.
The one's very brief. The one's actually for you, if I may. You said the land issue is about to become a real issue. It is a real issue. It's about to become a more pronounced real issue, and I think you're right. But I'd like to suggest that that's courtesy of the one player in the South African dynamic that hasn't been properly addressed, and that's the media. I mean, the media and academia, who are clearly driving the agenda intellectually or philosophically. I'd like to hear just the members of the panel addressing that question. But the thing I wanted to actually make, the point was about more pertinent for, or I made up already. You said in your question to the panel that you're surprised by the continued emphasis on ethnicity. You thought that was old-fashioned stuff. Mr. Mbeki amplified the point by talking about the old guard in both the National Party and the ANC. I think that, I don't want to over-egg the point, but we are living in a world where in the last few years, and in spite of the assiduous efforts of intellectuals and clerics and moral philosophers and politicians for generations, we're in the world where in the last year we've seen Brexit, Trump. I mean, me, Trump's a simple phenomenon of angry ethnicity. You've got Le Pen looming in France. We've actually got, if anything, the drift in the world outside of South Africa is in the opposite direction. Now, let me state my case. I drive a hybrid, and I'm a major advocate of hybridization. I believe that the best hope for the world is that everybody intermingles in the grandest way, and we end up with race actually literally disappearing. But I want to suggest that actually 2 things. One, we've got it wrong in that clearly human beings, other than us fortunate people who've got, can come to fancy gatherings like this and have got enough means to educate our kids and maybe fly around the world, most people take ethnicity perfectly seriously, and we've got to take their concerns seriously. But more importantly, this is actually addressed to Mr. Visa. Tax, surely tax is where the answer lies. And I'd like to I almost want to ask a personal question. The tax rate in the United States between 1954 and 1964, in its gung-ho capitalist years, was 90%, the top marginal tax rate. Why can't we in this country with our tortured history and our extreme maldistribution, I want to put it that way, why can't we say, all right, tell you what, we white guys, you got a real windfall from history. Let's go between 5 and 10% whites-only tax for a decade and more. Just as a way of saying, you know what, we're here, we're committed, we want to stay in this country. We know the past was egregiously bad. We do see, like we see a fantastic future. And the way we can do it, you know what, we rich guys, we'll give some of it back. Why is that a problem?
Thank you. Take a third question, please.
Thank you. Also got a couple, but the first one would be directed at Mr. Mbeki. He dwelt a lot on the Western influence on South Africa and how it affects us, but I just wondered what his take would be on the Eastern influence, because I think that was quite a large role player in the whole freedom coming to South Africa. And conversely, what is in South Africa's best interests with regard, would he agree with that? And the other is really just a comment that I think with land, we kid ourselves when we think that we own it, because it's here long before us and will be long after man is no longer on Earth. What would the panel's opinion be on some of the policies that exist, like in Zambia, of a 99-year lease?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take those. Jens, I'll come to you after. So Zach, first for you, the affirmative.
As far as the second sentence of Section 9.2 is concerned, I think that it's a very important part of the Constitution, and I think it is very important for us to take measures aimed at promoting equality. I believe in substantive equality, not formal equality. I don't believe in pretending that equality exists, and therefore real measures have to be taken to promote equality. And one of the important ways of doing so is for the state to take measures, again through tax. I agree with the tax point completely, to take measures to ensure that people are protected and advanced for the promotion of equality. That's a very important part of the Constitution. The judgment was right, and I would suggest to you that we ignore that at our peril. So if two things happen, if we do real things towards the promotion of equality, and I agree that in affirmative action, merit cannot be ignored completely and absolutely. I see affirmative action as an interesting balance between a redefinition of merit to a great extent, because merit is not necessarily how we used to do it before, and ensuring that there are more people in the workplace who are diverse. So it can't be only about merit, nor can it only be about ensuring that black people get in at all costs. Again, for me, it's a question of the appropriate balance, so that in some circumstances, measures are clearly wrong when you enrich a few people instead of enriching many more. In other cases where you employ an idiot to do a job which that idiot can't do, whether that idiot is white, black, Indian, or colored, and we have them in all colors in this country today, you cannot employ an idiot to do a job, because it does not fall within the constitutional parameter of to promote equality. Because you do not promote equality by employing somebody who can't do a job to do it.
Thank you very much.
But the second sentence of 9.2 is very important.
Thank you. Christo, do you want to take the tax question?
Yeah, the tax question, yeah. The first point I want to make is that, you know, at the time of the transition, there was a lot of discussion about a wealth tax and what have you. Of course, the problem that you run into, and I think people would have been, you know, quite open to that suggestion, except the first problem you run into is there's never a guarantee that that's it. Once you've paid, you've now, you know, cleaned the slate. Life doesn't work that way. So that's the first point. The second point is we have a progressive tax system. So, you know, the rich do pay more, or the high earners do pay more. The third point is, on any analysis, South Africa is not a low-taxed country. Rudolph, you can give us the figures, but I mean, the government budget is what now, 25% of the GDP? more like 30%. Now, you know, so that, by any standard, is amongst the highest, I would venture. So there's nothing wrong there. But
among emerging markets, it's extremely high.
yeah, yeah. So the point is, but then you bump the point the judge just made. Part of your problem is not a lack of money collected through taxes, but how it is spent incompetently and thievery, corruption. That's the problem. So it doesn't flow through. It doesn't do what it is intended to do. The intention is there. The tax rates are there, etc., etc. But we just don't get it through the system. And then the final point is, in emerging markets, yeah, Rudolf just made the point, but I remember once at a conference where the world was also in a very difficult stage, and there was a guy from Hong Kong, he was a banker, and he said, why do the Americans and the other people who were there, why don't you learn from us? Hong Kong at that stage had a tax rate of 10% or something, some flat sort of rate. Easy to fill in your form, easy to pay your tax, no loopholes. I mean, Donald Trump, I don't want to quote him as a beacon of hope, but I mean, you know, he says that, I mean, it'll take you a year to read through the American tax code.
So he didn't pay it then.
Yeah, yeah. He went to the trouble of reading through it and found the loopholes.
Yes.
Because invariably, the more complicated you make it, the more people will be incentivized to try and find the loopholes. You know, he in that debate with Hillary Clinton said when she attacked him about it, so that was very clever.
Yes.
And, you know, so the point is that, and just to come back, Judge, to I'm not advocating economic growth at all costs. But the point that I'm very happy to debate is that unless you have economic growth, you can achieve nothing. You can literally not, you can do whatever you want, stand on your head. You cannot address inequality unless you have economic growth. The question is, once you have economic growth, how do you then go about, if one of your objectives is to erase inequality or diminish it, how do you go about it? And that's where the tax thing and various other things.
Well, then you and I agree that there needs to be a balance between the two. And while I'm about it, can I just say that business mustn't be too clever about corruption in this country, because there is a level of corruption where people are stealing, you get ghost teachers and all that sort of thing. But the big corruption with politicians is people clapping with two hands. There's business on the one side, there's government on the other, and business is equally culpable. We must understand that.
Okay. Eastern influence?
Eastern influence. And,
Sweden?
well, okay, let me start with Western influence. I did talk a lot about the West, but that was on our history side and where South Africa is. But first, the Western societies and the Western countries are far and away the most successful societies today. They have the highest life expectancy. I think Japan is somewhere in 80 or 90. They have the greatest mastery of technology. That's why you have your Apples and your Nokias and what have you. And interestingly, they are relatively very egalitarian, far more egalitarian than we are in Africa, not just South Africa, but in Africa as a whole. Now, what's the secret to Western success? I can identify three things. First, competition. Western societies are driven by competition. They compete in their economic arena, in their production arena, in their distribution arena, and so on and so on. In order to sustain the competition, they have to become more and more technologically advanced. They compete, they use technology to compete amongst themselves. Whoever makes the first product or finds the first technology makes the more profit out of that patent. So competition drives the technological development. But to have technological development, you have to have education in your population. So this is the second secret of Western development, is education. And lastly, you have social and political mobilization. To me, those are the three secrets of the West, which is what puts them ahead of many parts of the world. Now, what happened to the East? The East went to study, starting with Japan. They went to study how the West does all these things, and they replicated them. The competition, they replicated. The education, they replicated. And they were not so keen on the social mobilization, but they did it anyway. Because what does the social mobilization do is it addresses the issues of inequality, the human rights of the population, the welfare state, and all those. These are not gifts, they are results of social mobilization, especially through the social democratic tradition of the West. So there is actually not the same difference that we think in Africa between the East and the West. Certainly, the developed part of the East, like Japan, South Korea, there isn't that big a difference in what drives those societies. Of course, they have their own languages, they have their own religions, they are not Christians, and so on. And this is the problem that China is faced with. China is driving the competition, China is driving the education, but it is opposing the social mobilization because they have the monopoly of political power to the Communist Party. So, and I pointed out the problems that the world is sitting with China precisely because of its opposition to the social mobilization, to civil society, free flow of information, and all those issues. Now, for us in South Africa, well, we have no other, there is no other unique formula for development for South Africa than the three that the West has followed. We have to have competition. We have very little competition in our country. Why? If you look at our economic history, the mining industry and the agriculture industry, which drove the development of South Africa, they were opposed to competition because they wanted cheap labor. So amongst themselves, they did not allow competition amongst workers. The past system opposed competition and so on and so forth. So these are all the issues that have to be addressed. We have an appalling education system in this country, a public education system. But actually, we have a very successful private education system. Why? Because there's competition in the private education system. I met a couple once in South Korea who were emigrating to South Africa. They said that they didn't want their children to be subjected to the horrors of the schooling system of Korean education. And they said they looked all over the world to find a very good education system that was as good as anything in Korea. And they identified South Africa. And it was the private education system that they identified in South Africa, because that's where there is competition. There is no competition in the state education system. If you get 30%, well, you have passed, and so on and so forth. So I think that we have to move away from the notion that there is an Eastern model that succeeds, West model. Sweden, by the way, has got some of the largest multinationals in the world, which are privately owned. Your Volvos, your Electrolux, your H&Ms, you name it. But they have the social mobilization to ensure a fair distribution of the results of the productivity of the Swedish economy. So those I think, are the building blocks of success that South Africa has to also follow if we want to achieve the similar success. Now, this brings in issue of leadership, and this is a big issue in South Africa. Again, we're used to racial politics. Now, racial politics will not provide you with the leadership when you have to compete. Because what did racial politics do for South Africa? It introduced job reservation. And what does job reservation do? It abolishes competition, and it stultified the education system. It stultified, at the end of the day, the growth of the South African economy. So we have to move away from, in my view, from all those past ways. But there is really no mystery about how the West got to where it got to.
Thank you very much. So you asked a question about land. I see your hand there. I just wanted to answer that. So I'm rereading Saul Plaatje, Native Land in South Africa, which he started writing almost immediately after the laws taking away black land was passed, and he wrote about what he had witnessed. And increasingly, I'm finding in many, many conversations that our next generation is telling us this, that our arc of our history, it bent towards peace and pragmatism as it needed to, but it didn't bend toward economic justice. So be it on land or be it on the absolute fury about the Absa lifeboat, which really is quite a non-story if you read the Davis Committee report. But there is this view in our young society, and it's one I think we'd be careful to listen to, is that there somewhere is this pot of looted money which, if brought back, if returned, would just make things okay. It's not going to do that, because I think we need much deeper reforms to our economy. But it is a voice that I think we must pay much more careful attention to, because it's impacting our politics fundamentally. So I saw Tiens, and then Rudolph, and then at the back there's a hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Ferrell. If Mr. de Klerk had been here, he would have been part of the panel, so he would have been able to answer that question. So I feel obliged. But also I'd like to comment on the question of majorities and minorities. Sure. Probably like Malaysia, I'm also from the old guard, probably after 60. So, but I don't think it's an old guard problem. I think there is a real problem here. And even if it's a problem of perceptions. Let me share with you quickly. The Public Service Commission at the end of 2014 had a working document in which it identified that the 3 biggest reasons for bad service delivery in public service was affirmative action, employment equity, and cadre deployment. It was sanitized, but that was it, and it stood. Nothing came of that. It, amongst others, said that we don't need affirmative action in the public service anymore, but nothing came of that. The result of that was twofold. The one is that we have a serious problem in the capacity of the civil service. And what Judge Jacob said about an idiot doing work, you either appoint someone who's not capable of doing the job, or you keep the post vacant. And that had I think it's common cause to say that the civil service has real problems throughout the civil service, getting worse on lower level because of affirmative action, employment equity, and cadre deployment gone wrong. I'm not saying it wasn't necessary, it isn't necessary, it's gone wrong. The way it's gone wrong, I believe, is because of the formula of demographic representativity. That all organizations, in their individuality, every small section of the civil service and the private sector must reflect 80-9-9-2. 80 African, 9 colored, 9 white, and 2% Indians. And the irony of this is that the way it's being implemented, and there's a court case of an Indian police officer, a female, who didn't get a job, and it went to court, and the judge asked the state person, why didn't this woman got the job? She was the best. She's from a designated group. She's not only a woman, she's also Indian. And he said, Your Honor, well, the problem is the formula is 8992. This unit is 9 persons big, and 2% of 9 is less than 1. Now, that's funny, but it's tragic too. And unfortunately, that is exactly how it's going to happen. And I think what I think President Klerk referred to is that if that's the case, then the formula will be that you're only transformed in this country, in any organization, churches, welfare organizations, if you reflect that. And I think that's nonsense. I think it's unconstitutional. And I think it started with a wrong interpretation of certain laws, and also probably the Van Heerden case helped. Now, that is exacerbated by a whole host of ideological laws, to my mind, that re-racializes South Africa. We can talk about majorities and minorities. The point is, there's an 80% African majority, and there are 2-3 racial minorities on the other side, because the laws these days force you to think of race. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, where we actually and visibly tried to be non-racial. I'm forced to think as a white person again. Not because I want to, but because I'm forced to. The last point I want to make is, unfortunately, President Mbeki and the ANC, not him personally, but also referred to whites as colonialists of a special type. Now, how do I get rid of that colonial past of mine? Do I go back to Germany, where my forefathers came from in 1781? Or what do I do? I mean, there's no answer to that. The point I want to make, Ferrell, is that I wouldn't go as far as to say whites or any other group will be alienated. I want to say that the Constitution does make provision in the Commission for the Cultural, Linguistic and Religious Rights of communities. The problem is not the Constitution. The problem is the ideology of demographic representativity that forces us into minorities, into racial minorities. And whether one agrees with that or not, this is a big stumbling block in getting to a reconciled, reconstructed economy. Because if you're going to alienate whites and coloreds and Indians, or even some black Africans, then you will not get it right. The perception, in your book you wrote that young Africans think that there are between 15 and 20% whites in this country.
Yeah.
That's a perception. I think the perception of the white community, and to a large extent these days the colored community, is that they're being pushed out of any job in any area they want to be in. And I think that's the problem, that whether one agrees with it or not, it's a fact, because perceptions create reality.
But for some of us, like me, the thought of going back to that apartheid appellation of being an Indian stroke Cape Malay rather than the South African I love being is not
I agree.
comfortable. Yeah.
But it's not you and me who determines that, it's the government.
I'm not sure. I don't want to argue. Rudolph, yes.
The judge referred to us not we shouldn't be striving for growth at any cost, and I would certainly agree with that, especially because if it has major environmental impacts and so on, as we've, for instance, seen in China. But I think at the root of inequality in South Africa, and of course there are a bit of apartheid history and so forth, lies unemployment and education. If you look at our unemployment rate from 1980, it's been an almost straight line up. And that straight line is interrupted by swings, and those swings correlate nearly perfectly with periods of faster and slower economic growth. As soon as you had faster growth, you had a falling unemployment rate, and vice versa. But the long-term trend has been upwards. And the long-term trend, contrary to what you would expect, correlates nearly perfectly with the long-term uptrend in the Bureau for Economic Research's results of their survey, where business people are asked, what are the impediments to your expanding your business faster? And of course the range of things, but one of them is a lack of skilled labor. Now South Africa must be pretty unique in that we've had a strongly rising long-term trend in unemployment, but you've had a strongly rising uptrend with cyclical swings in the shortage of skilled labor as a constraint on investment and on business, which says to me that the two major problems is unemployment and education. The unemployability of such a large part of our population on account of the poor education. Now, Mr. Nzimande said this past week he blames GEAR for the lack of funds for education and so forth. Lack of funds has never been really the issue. We've got one of the highest ratios of educational spending to GDP among all the emerging markets, and yet we've got, by any measure, the worst outcomes on maths, on science, and on a range of others. This is a government failing which directly contributed to the inequality in our country And I just want to leave it at that.
Thank you. Yes, please do.
Something to what Moletti had said when he made the very valid point about competition. I was at a meeting with the Minister of Finance where there was one of the CEOs of one of these private school companies. And he had a whole paper there. I keep on meaning to get it from him, where he showed what the government spends per school child on education. And he had done a presentation for the minister to say that if you give children a voucher for that amount, less 20%, which will save the government billions, we, these private educational facilities, will educate the children, and based on our track record compared to government track record, the output will be exponentially better. Now, you know, that's again a very nice subject to get into a debate, you know, on ideology. Why not do it that way? It seems perfectly obvious. And then I recalled years ago reading that the Office of the Budget in the United States, now Rudolph, again, maybe there you can help me, did a calculation that there is no single service that the United States federal government delivers that the private sector cannot deliver 20 or 30% cheaper.
Interesting. I was really interested to hear that Sizwe Kasana, who was heading the National Education Collaboration Trust to fix, I think, higher education, he started a string of private schools to compete with Kuro. So it really is a fast-growing sector. There was a question at the back, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. My name is Noinkyanga, and today I'm just representing myself. One point I want to make first is every time I come to these spaces, I would hear business people complaining about how bad things are without really acknowledging how they contribute to the governance problems that we have in this country. For example, last year there was a UN report which says that South Africa lost about 2 trillion to illicit financial flows. We have price-fixing scandals, cartels, monopolies. The list is going on. I mean, I can name it. It's everywhere. Everyone is talking about these things. But when we are here, sometimes these issues don't come up. We'll hear about how heavily taxed business is, how corrupt things are, without business acknowledging the role that they are playing. They will get state tenders to build houses for the people. What has happened to those houses? They are falling. They are falling. And government, what government is currently doing is that government has got to fix these houses again. So business is as bad as this government. It is contributing to these problems, and we need to be honest with ourselves and talk about these things, because we are contributing, we are part of the problems. So my question to all the panelists, because some of them, I mean, like I'm thinking about Dr. Moletti and you, Doctor, you talked about these things, about how bad things are. And then I was thinking to myself, but business is not clean. And I do want to say that business in this country is complaining too much, yet democracy has been good to it. That was just my comment. And this is what I will say when I'm representing myself.
Thank you.
Can I just say I agree completely. The textbook delivery saga is again a problem of business. Not only a problem of government. Some business has been absolutely and utterly dishonest. Business charges government too much money, government pays it, there's a corruption and so on. So I'd really like to know, what are you guys in business going to do to put your own affairs in order? Because if you make sure that you guys are not corrupt, the world would be a much, much better place. So I really would like to ask that question.
Thank you. Please
I
answer.
respond. I mean, this is really a debate I would like to engage in. Let me start off by saying that undoubtedly there are corrupt and dishonest business people. Here is, however, the difficulty when you start talking about corruption in government and corruption in business. Business is rather like the point I tried to make, that there is no group the rich. There is no group business. There are thousands of businesses in South Africa, and amongst those you will find dishonest and corrupt people, inevitably. Government, however, is a single entity. And when you complain about business people taking government for a ride in terms of building houses that fall apart, whose fault is that? I mean, government is the owner, is the employer who employs the people to build the houses. So why don't they do a proper job? If I employ a builder, as I often do I just leave him to carry on and rip me off? I don't, because it's my money. I have to make sure that I get value for my money. It just seems that government apparently doesn't care, or maybe it is because there is the backhand sort of arrangements that we just saw, the big thing that blew up in the Free State and then quietened down again. So that is the essential difference. I'm not arguing that all business people are little angels and won't do wrong things. That's not the point. But, you know, to sort of have this broad, that's exactly what I'm afraid of, this broad brush stroke to say business must get its house in order, I think is unfair.
But the broad brush stroke doesn't even apply to government, because that is also unfair. There are good people in government who are being messed around a great deal, and the good people in government are being messed around because of the way in which business and the bad people in government collaborate. So all I'm saying is that business and commerce must take some responsibility. You can't avoid that responsibility by saying that, no, there are many of us and we can't control everybody. Well, whether you can control everyone or not, you have an obligation to this country as business before you extol its virtues to get this house completely in order.
Okay. First, I have to, I'm also part of the business sector. I've started a media company and we publish books, and we have a TV production company and we produce TV programs.
Date my family.
No, Isidingo is our flagship, and we do Big Brother, that's another one that we do. And we've published, our flagship book is A History of Inequality in South Africa by Peter Blanche, which we published in 2002. So, if I take our TV production company, the single largest broadcaster in this country in terms of audiences is SABC. Isidingo, we sell it to SABC. There are huge number of other companies that compete with us to produce programs for SABC. You have Generations, Seven Dilan, Isidingo, Muvango, you can go on and on and on. But where is the difficulty? The difficulty is the mismanagement of SABC, which Parliament is responsible for and has allowed the situation to develop until you got an explosion a few months ago.
SABC guys at the back going, that's
Oh,
right.
are they?
They are.
So the relationship between business and the state itself, I'm not talking about corruption, I'm just talking about mismanagement. So the second thing that it is important to understand is that society has given to the government, to this leadership of society's interests. So it is not for business to police crime in the society. It's the state's responsibility to police society, to ensure the constitution and the laws are abided by. It's not the job of business. We vote for the government, we pay taxes to the government, all of us as South Africans. Why do we do it? In order for the government to make sure we have a clean, non-corrupt countries and that the laws of the country are obeyed. Why are the laws not being obeyed? The government is not enforcing the laws. So my sister at the back there who is saying that, of course, there are price-fixing cartels. But some of these cartels are your Transnets. Transnet is a price-fixing one organization cartel. The Port of Durban, for example, is reputedly the highest freight charges in the world are by the Port of Durban. And what is the consequence of that? It raises the price of everything that comes in and out of South Africa through the Port of Durban, and it puts our goods in an uncompetitive situation vis-a-vis our competing producers in other countries. So I think one, in this debate that about the private sector versus government, the reality is that the government has the mandate and has the resources, but it is failing in its duties to manage the likes of SABC, the likes of Transnet, the likes of Telkom, which are very strategic industries for the rest of the economy. But the government allows this to be monopolies. I'll conclude by pointing out there is a report. Tins has made a point about another report. There is a report that the South African government commissioned, and it was funded by the UK government on how best to manage South African railway network. We have a massive railway network in this country of over 20,000 kilometers. This report was done by the Adam Smith Institution, remember, at the request of the ANC government. What has happened to this report? They have hidden it from the population because the report points out that you have to introduce competition in rail transport. You have to introduce private operators into the transport system, although the government must continue to own and manage the railway infrastructure. The government has hidden all these reports. So the question of what government itself is doing, the government is doing hugely dubious things like hiding reports that are calling for improvement in how South Africa operates.
Thank you, Moletsi. Judge, I can see your steam coming out
our
of your
difference,
ears.
Our difference, Moletsi, is this. I agree that the government is doing many things wrong. I have no troubles with that, and to that extent there is a problem. My difficulty is that I think that business is doing more things wrong than we know, and that the fault lies with both virtually equally. The second thing I wanted to say, and business can't say, well, business can't in the one breath say, we are very good, let us progress without regulation, and this country will come right. On the one hand, speaking as a representative of business, and then say in the next breath, actually, there are some businesses which are bad, but that's got nothing to do with us. If businesses are bad and you want government to regulate, then business has to agree that government regulation is a good thing. Secondly, why not self-regulation? Why can't business regulate itself? It can't pass it off onto government. As I said in my talk, it is not the job of the government to implement the values of our constitution. We should all have a change of heart. We should all think about how we conduct our businesses and what we do, because we need change everywhere. And finally, I must say to Churns that I don't think Van Heerden said that you can have percentages in this way, in the way in which the law is applying them. And I agree with you that having these strict percentages instead of having those as objectives and bringing merit into the criterion, is the recipe for disaster. But I'm agreeing with you in a very limited way. I would say that affirmative action is good. Having strict percentages at this stage is absolute nonsense. And I agree with you that the education system, education and health are perhaps two of the biggest problems in our country. How those things are to be solved, I really don't know. And I agree. You know, in an odd way, it is the bad education and the bad health system that leads to this petty corruption that we have. So what do you do if you're earning 12 grand a month or something and you can't afford a private hospital? Your medical aid doesn't cater for it. You got to go to, your mother gets ill with cancer or something, and the only way you can get her to a hospital is to pay, and then you have a justification to be corrupt. What do you do if you have a kid and you can't afford the 40, 50,000 rand a year fees that you have to pay to get your child to education, and you know as a civil servant how miserable the education system is, then you get corrupted. There's a symbiotic relationship between all those things. So I absolutely agree that there are many, many, many things that government is doing wrong. What I think we should not do is whitewash business as an entity. Business as an entity is problematic, and because there are dishonest people in business who will take advantage of everything, you cannot have that sector absolutely unregulated. Business will do anything to make money, however corrupt or however much corruption or crookery is required, because their aim is to make a profit. And these days, lawyers help them because they find ways and means of making obviously illegitimate things legitimate in one way or another. And these are the sorts of problems which we are facing. We need a change, not only in government, we need a change in the whole of society. Because if civil society is not going to get better, civil society is not going to exercise pressure on the ANC to get it right. Where do you think the ANC gets its money from? From business. Business will contribute to the ANC because it will benefit from an ANC government, and the more the ANC government gives to them, the better. So to that extent, and to the successes of the ANC, business is also equally responsible by the contribution that it makes to the African National Congress and to government to get contracts and all that sort of thing. So really, to say that there are a few corrupt people in business is wrong. I would like to suggest that business is an entity, and I would like to put the proposition the other way, that there are a few exceptionally moral business people, but those are the absolute exception. The businessmen I know, most of them will do anything they can get away with, however immoral, to make more money.
Judge, you
Sorry,
have,
Ferry, may I just respond?
you must, okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Let us respond. Let me say where I am from. Sorry, I specialize in labor law, and my previous consultancy, I represented about 3,000 businesses. And businesses are committed to making sure they are compliant, and that was our approach. Further to that, Judge, you may say, all business, you can't paint them with the same brush. On your side, then I might say all advocates or all lawyers are dishonest. You can't do that. So the fact in business, and where I'm coming from as, and maybe I should speak for business, is business wants to be compliant, and business also makes sure it's compliant, but where we fall short is the compliance that has to be enforced from government is not done. SARS does an excellent job, but the rest of the departments that should look at compliance do not do their work properly. But as business, I can speak for business, as I'm also the representative of the Cape Chamber of Commerce as one of my clients, and those businesses strive to be compliant. So I totally disagree from what you're saying, Judge.
Thank you. Wendy, I see you, Christo. So Wendy, you were saying a rude word there. Yeah, so you must please respond to.
My husband refuses to allow me to speak.
Okay.
But that's never stopped me, and nor will it today. But I think it's a gross exaggeration to say that the majority of business is corrupt. I think if one had to look at the percentage of government that is corrupt as opposed to the percentage of business that is corrupt, government wins hands down.
Okay. Please, Chris. Mr. Carry on. And then Zora wants to close it. Yes.
You know, Wendy, I think, has just about made the point, and the previous speaker, the point that I wanted to react very strongly to the judge's comment, because that is, as he pointed out, I'm a failed lawyer, but that is when people say
And a failed farmer.
and a failing.
Oh, okay.
It's the old story about the guy who said, you know, the problem is it's the 99% of the lawyers who give the 1% a bad name. So, I mean, that is, with the greatest of respect, I mean, totally, we've got to then robustly agree to disagree on that point. Because the point I'm trying to get across, as a business person, and I'd like to believe that I'm an honest and moral business person, to the best of my knowledge, I have not ever been prosecuted for bribery or corruption or whatever. So I have to accept that my record is pretty clean. I have no mandate, none whatsoever, to police the rest of the people in business, a lot of whom I will never do business with. But government has a very clear mandate to manage the country, A, and B, unlike me, government has the power of the law to enforce its mandate. That, with the greatest of respect, is an enormous difference, and therefore I submit that under no circumstances can one equate corruption in business, which does exist undoubtedly, with the corruption in government.
Can I just say one more thing, which is...
A short thing, Judge. Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing, which is this. I'm not saying that you are corrupt at all. I am not saying that you are dishonest. But it is, a businessman can't say, on the one hand, that government doesn't do the policing properly and that's why all businesses are corrupt. And then in the same breath you say, there have been no charges against me, and therefore I am absolutely fine. Because as a matter of logic, I have to say to you, I'm not saying you're a bad guy at all, right? But I'm saying the fact that there are no charges against you is no proof that you are an honest businessman. Because you may have no charges because of the idiotic inefficiencies of government. I don't know.
There's that. Okay, please.
Yeah, so
please.
maybe
I mean, if it is the idiotic inefficiency of government, you've just proven my point.
Okay, so thank you. That was fun.
Thank you. I think we have just demonstrated the character of the South African society now in this debate. We sometimes don't want to rise above our issues. We want to swim in them as both participants and people that evaluate them. If you look at the world mechanism to deal with global corruption, you have a report that has been issued by the World Economic Forum on the risk issues which Dr. Wiese spoke about. But why can't business in South Africa sponsor such things where they take an active role as a business community of South Africa to say, these are the things that we see, and they support some of the think tanks to do that. That's one. Two, I think when the judge, I'm not sure what the judge meant when he says, what about self-regulation? But I would agree with that if it means businesses must be able to have a peer review mechanism of themselves. The success of our governance model, the King 1, 2, 3, and now 4, has made listed companies in South Africa to behave differently because there's a self-regulatory mechanism that business subscribed to voluntarily. Why can't you come with something that deals with corruption in a particular way so that some of the people that supply Checkers or Shoprite, they must know that if they are found to have done something wrong with government, you will not allow them to supply you. Now, it is those things that will make business to self-regulate. The last thing is that when we say business, we must know that there are small businesses who are emerging, who only government is their market. They are not part of the system. And therefore, probably when the judge says business is responsible, he's referring to those that are getting tenders and what. But in the eyes of the community, these are business people that are doing those things. So I think we need to have a conversation that says who is business and who is tarnishing us and what do we do about it as business so that we can demonstrate. I think I like the global mechanism. I wish we could replicate it in South Africa. By now, business in South Africa should have already said the succession in the ANC is a business risk. They should have already said that by now. If they had systems that they are communicating and all those things and what. They should have said many things. But I think our business people have long been focused on the other side of profit and not on the other side of being social activists. And this debate has just convinced me. It's something that I think I'm now convinced it's true. Thank you.
We have to close now. I'm so very sorry. Zora.
I just want to use the opportunity to ask one final question by way of conclusion to our panelists. We've by and large agreed that we're at a crossroads. From your individual, whether it's from a legal perspective, business, choose the lane you want to be in. You don't have to maintain what you've been asked to do through your speech. But read the tea leaves for us. Next 10 years, what's to be expected? Which road? Are we going to take the high road? Are we taking the low road? Are we going to remain at a crossroads?
Thank you. Please, so let's just all do that. Eh? Do you want to go, Judge? Or? I don't mind. Okay. Please, Christo, you go.
Undoubtedly, I am totally convinced, based on my experience of South Africa and South Africans, that we will be on the right road. I mean, I tried to make that point that I have absolutely no doubt. There will be bumps, but there are bumps all over the world. That's the other point I tried to make. So if I read the tea leaves, that's how I see it. We will get through our difficulties with setbacks. I must say today it's been a bit of an enlightening experience for me to sense, maybe I should be more aware of that. But sometimes, you just plow ahead. How deep a mistrust in a section of our society there is of business. I see the function of business to fulfill an economic need. I mean, that's its raison d'etre, to make a profit, to employ people, and to pay taxes and help the country develop. That's how I see business.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very nervous about reading tea leaves. We have so many sangomas in this country. Some of them called economists who read lots of tea leaves and tell us what's going to happen in the future. My own sense about South Africa is that South Africa has huge number of strengths. As a country, we have a huge number of strengths. We have a very diverse population that brings in not minorities and majorities, that brings in global talents. That is one of South Africa's strengths. We have a huge country physically. South Africa is one of the largest countries on the African continent. And we have massive endowment of natural resources in South Africa, which there are very few countries that can match our endowments. However, South Africa has, I was trying to figure out who to use as one of the last great leaders of South Africa that I can talk about, and I'm not going to talk about Mandela. One of the last great leaders of South Africa was Shaka. And he created a state in Southeast South Africa. He was one of the last great leaders of South Africa. But what has been happening in South Africa, we have been producing very poor leadership. Now, how do we solve this problem? I have no idea. But we have all the building blocks to create a great country. There's one piece that is missing, and this is leadership in South Africa. And that I don't know how we... So I don't think South Africa is going to crash because it has all the strengths that I've mentioned. But for it to take off in the way that we want it to take off, we have to have definitely a new leadership in this country that understands. For example, most South Africans, certainly those in the government, think that South Africa depends on China. Actually, it's the other way around. China depends on South Africa. The Chinese steel industry wouldn't be where it is without South African chrome and without South African manganese. But when you see our leaders going to Beijing, scraping and bowing, asking for favors from the Chinese, it's because they are the poor leaders that they are. They don't know the strengths of the country. So to me, that is something that we have to put all our heads together to say, how do we solve the leadership problem that South Africa has been living with for many years? It's not just now.
Zach? I will end.
I think, well, I hope rather, that we will end up on the high road, and I believe ultimately we will, because I trust not our leaders, but I trust our people, I trust civil society. We have always said that it is necessary to have a strong civil society to hold government to account. And part of the problem is that civil society at all levels has A, not been strong enough, and B, to a degree, been complicit in the problem. So if we develop a strong civil society, and if we ensure that everyone takes responsibility for their actions, and if we ensure that business too begins a program in terms of which it stops corruption within its own rank, because all of us have a contribution to make instead of saying to government, you do it. If we as civil society and we as business exercise our voting rights and our powers in civil society responsibly, and we begin to show our muscle, we will go a long, long way. But that means that we have to develop the strong civil society, because many of us began to think that once we had our democracy on paper, all the problems were solved. Now we know that our problems are not solved, and therefore, quite apart from the court, we need a strong civil society, a strong moral, ethical, overall civil society in order to bring government to account, in order to bring educational institutions to account, in order to bring teachers to account, in order to bring business to account, and in order to bring everyone involved in it to account. And I think that unless we can develop that kind of strong civil society, we're going to be in a great deal of trouble. I suspect that there'll be little choice for the government but to improve if it sees that it is going to be in danger. There seem to be fewer signs of that. But we definitely need a strong civil society to ensure the improvement of our society. And I think that unless we have a strong civil society, whoever we have in government, we will be in huge trouble ultimately.
Thank you. So I'll be your Sangoma then. I don't think Cyril Ramaphosa, I don't think it's a natural bet that he will be our next president. Things have shifted fundamentally in the past 2 months. But on the other hand, I'm a I feel greatly optimistic because last year we had a front row seat to see how our country beat back the agents of state capture in ways that I think quite sustainable and resilient. And it's that impetus in the South African DNA that will carry us forward as, I don't know if Molitsi agrees, the ANC becomes a smaller and smaller party in front of us, even though it enjoys such a large majority, even off the last election. So tough year, but nothing, I don't think there's anything that we cannot surf through. It's a pity we aren't using the best of us at the moment. So thank you. I think Zora will say the final word to our panel of fine minds.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Ferial. That was wonderful. I think it was certainly deserves a round of applause. So, folks, we've come to the end of our proceedings today, and it has never been the intention of the foundation to aim for consensus. I think just listening to the dialogue and the back and forth between Christoph and Christo and Zach, one gets got a real sense of divergent positions, and that's precisely what the foundation had not intended for this to happen, but certainly to provide the mechanism, the space for these sorts of hard conversations to happen. The foundation, with its own commitment to constitutionalism and the defense of the Constitution, is pleased that certainly each of our speakers, and I think everyone in this room, is of the view that we need to guard, we need to protect the Constitution. And I think the judge said it best when he said, not in your own words, Zach, I will interpret, but it appears to many of us as if it is the last bastion in the current times. I wish it weren't so, and I wish in the future there'd be several bastions of our democracy littered all over our society and all over our politics and our economics. There have been several issues that have come out today. Yes, our unequivocal commitment to the Constitution, because the Constitution truly, I believe, captures our past, our aspirations, and crucially, because the Constitution identifies the rules of the game, rules that apply equally and fairly to all. We've traversed a wide range of topics, some that got blood pressures up, but that's all right. I think, that feistiness is exactly what we need and what we are renowned for. We've grappled with the issue of the Constitution, the centrality of the Constitution. We've grappled with the issue of meanings of belonging, meanings of minorities and majorities. And I think we're going to continue to grapple with that. We haven't concluded, and I don't think we're going to conclude, even if we do, as many of you said, kind of traverse that high road in the next couple of years. We're not going to grasp the role of the economy and the nexus between the economy and social and economic justice. It's something that we're going to have to talk about again and again and again. The other issue, and I often refer to it as the proverbial South African elephant in the room, is land and property rights. We haven't tried to avoid it today. We've grasped it. We haven't come to any conclusions. We will continue to talk about that. It was a deliberate question to aid me to ask our panelists to read the tea leaves. And what I'm pleased about is, despite our disagreements, the fact that we don't have consensus on a large number of issues, there's a sense of positive endeavor about the future. Because I think if you take that away, you have nothing. What is there? Very little. And that is something that we've all agreed to do and think about and reach out to other people in whatever spheres we find ourselves, and think about the future. So as F.W. de Klerk said in his speech yesterday at the dinner and today, he believes the glass is half full, and so do I. Certainly, I want to say thank you to everyone. It's been a wonderful session. I think there's been an openness of discussion. I hope we're going to have opportunity to talk beyond the proceedings today. So many, many thanks.
Thank you. Oh, yes, of course. Zach. Yes, let me just help the judge.